Okay, here's part 2 of the introduction to our syllabus and to English 304, film genres, scenes from the 70s. We are now at the point in the syllabus where the screening, reading, and lecture schedule is laid out for you, starting right about here. And as you can see, I've laid it out week by week, day by day, right up until the end where the academic honesty quiz appears. I'm going to go back to the beginning and just say a few words about what's going to happen each week. When I get back to town, I'm going to finally be meeting with you on Monday, September 9th. But in the meantime, take a look at the YouTube videos that I have put up here for this week as you're preparing for next week, just to get some good background for the first film we're going to see and also get a sense of what was going on at the end of the 60s. This link will take you to a number of YouTube videos that give you background for the first film we're watching, which is titled Medium Cool. This link will give you access to a bunch of videos about the end of the 60s, what was going on in the United States during this period. And this link will give you access to some videos about the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention, which, by the way, is also background for the film Medium Cool, which unfolds during the 1968 Democratic Convention that happened in Chicago and during which there was a lot of civil unrest and what was termed police riots, that is to say, riots really instigated by the police rather than by the protesters and demonstrators. These are recommended films for getting a sense of some films that were coming out right at the end of the 1960s. Go ahead and look them up and maybe see some of them in preparation for our first week. So on Monday, we'll be looking at, we'll be discussing our first reading from the American cinema of the 70s, read the introduction and the year 1970, pages 1 through 47. That's a lot of reading for this weekend, so you want to get underway right away with the textbook. I've also made available 2 reviews of Medium Cool on our Sakai site, and whenever you see a reading assignment in yellow, as I said, these are the ones that you can actually get a link to on Sakai. I'm going to click on this now and hope that it pops up. Yeah, my internet is a little slow here. It should appear in this space. There we go. Reviews of Medium Cool. These are reviews that came out the year the film came out in 1969. 68, 69. I'm going to navigate back. So do read those two reviews actually. And so that's a lot of reading for next week in order to be prepared for our first full day of class. We're going to talk about the war, student massacres, riots in the streets, and our case study for this week will be Medium Cool. Later on that day, after our discussion at 2 to 3:15, we'll be moving over to the screening room and we will watch Medium Cool by Haskell Wexler. This movie, by the way, is really unusual. It's unlike any of the other films we'll be seeing this semester insofar as it is somewhat experimental for the period. It was a kind of combination of documentary and fiction film. It is a fictional story, but Haskell Wexler managed to incorporate a lot of documentary footage of events that were going on in Chicago while he was shooting the film. And so I think you'll find that very interesting. And we'll talk about that mixture of fiction or documentary when we meet in the next class period, Wednesday, September 11th. And I'll talk to you about how to do a close reading of a sequence in film in preparation for your first paper. There are a couple of YouTube videos that you might want to take a look at before then. One by Marshall McLuhan, and another one, Dick Cavett interviews Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan was a communications theorist whose theories of communication and media were very, very influential in the 60s and the early 70s. And I want you to get a sense of how popular he was even at the time, so that people were watching him talk about it on television, in fact. There are some recommended films here in preparation for the next film we're going to watch, any classic westerns of the 40s and 50s to compare to our second film, which is McCabe and Mrs. Miller by Robert Altman. But I have a little clip of High Noon here if you want to take a look at that. A great example of a classic western. So we'll be moving into the Robert Altman film the following week. Each week we'll discuss the film we viewed on a Monday afternoon. We'll discuss that on Wednesday and the following Monday, and then we watch the next film for the next Wednesday and Monday. So in the following week we're going to be moving on to McCabe and Mrs. Miller by Robert Altman. I think the heyday of Altman's filmmaking was in the 1970s, though he continued to make films right up until very recently when he died. So we'll be looking at one of his earliest films, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is a kind of, it's his take on the classic Western. Some people call it an anti-Western. I want you to read this article by Robert Kolker, or a chapter from his book, A Cinema of Loneliness, on McCabe and Mrs. Miller. We're not always reading stuff from our textbook. Sometimes we're reading these articles. And by the way, I'm also going to screen in class, before we see McCabe and Mrs. Miller, this short film called Mudflats Living, a documentary which, as you'll see, is going to have something to do with the feature film that we're watching. We will then move on to a kind of remake of the classic noir film, Alan Pakula's Clute, with Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland, set in New York. We'll see more than one movie set in New York, actually, so we can sort of compare the New York settings. And ditto for Chicago. New York and Chicago are going to be two important cityscapes for us in this film course. And we're going to start talking about the question of paranoia. Paranoia, which was, I would say, one of the dominating cultural moods of the 1970s, certainly of the early 1970s, in particular in terms of how it related to Watergate, Nixon, and the sense, a sort of massive sense that there was something to be suspicious about. And you'll see the many different ways in which we will be talking about paranoia, fear of invasion, etc. In a number of films, starting with Clute. I've termed this week, Wednesday, September 25th, Even Paranoids Have Enemies. And we're going to take a little case study for paranoia here. By that I mean we're going to focus on one actor in particular, or actress, Jane Fonda. She features in Clute, but she and Donald Sutherland also made an anti-war film in this period, and actually had a lot of did stage performances in which they sort of dramatized what was going on in Vietnam for audiences. The film they made really wasn't that well known. It was suppressed. So we're going to take a look at that. The film was titled FTA. I'll show clips from it in class, and you'll be able to have access to it in the library as well. So when we get finished with Clute and Fonda and Sutherland's anti-war activity, we're going to move on to a film titled The Spook Who Sat by the Door by Ivan Dixon. I'm going to introduce you to the idea of blaxploitation films at this point. But the movie that we're focusing on, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, is not actually a blaxploitation film itself. It's more of a protest film. And we'll talk about the difference between an African American protest film and blaxploitation films from this period. And as you can see, I've lined up lots of YouTube videos to look at for this period and also Watergate. We're going to talk about racial politics, Watergate, the idea of the man, right? The man, both in terms of the white man and also in terms of Nixon and the downfall of the man. Your short paper is going to be due on October 7th. By this time, you will have received an assignment from me through the assignments thing. And we'll move on then to the conversation. This will be the one Francis Ford Coppola film that we will look at, though there are plenty of others we could also have watched, but I really want to do a range of directors this semester. So we're going to look at The Conversation, which is you will less likely have seen than The Godfather, for instance. And this too is a film about paranoia, about recording devices, people being bugged, which, as you'll see, is a huge theme in the early 70s, particularly in terms of how the Watergate affair unfolded, involving all sorts of suspicious tapes itself. And of course, each week there are various readings that go along with the films. I expect you to do all the reading in time for class. So by the way, when it says reading under a certain date, that's the time by which you have to have finished the reading so that we can talk about it in class. There are no classes on October 14th. Monday, there's a holiday then, so we meet on Wednesday. We're going to do a little workshop on how to analyze sound in The Conversation. And that same day, because Monday happens on a Wednesday, our screening time at 3:30 is going to happen on Wednesday afternoon, and that is when our midterm exam is going to be held. So make sure that you are available on that day at 3:30 for the midterm exam, Wednesday, October 16th. Put that in your calendar right now, and make sure it does not conflict with any kind of work schedule or any other kind of schedule. You need to be there for the midterm exam. So schedule that in now. We're going to move on then to the women's movement from that period, what people would call women's liberation or women's lib in the 70s. And we're going to watch a couple of films relating to that, though the issues will have come up already in prior films, but we're going to focus on it in more depth in these weeks. For instance, you can look at the Shirley Chisholm video, a woman who ran for president, 1972. Did you know that? And also, we're going to look at an experimental film by Marjorie Keller titled Misconception. I'm going to show it in class. It's just a short experimental film, and it's a way of getting prepared for the Stepford Wives, popular film, the 1975 Stepford Wives, not the recent remake of the Stepford Wives by Brian Forbes. And this will allow us to explore some issues about feminism, the status of women at this point, etc., in the 70s in the U.S. We'll move on to Brian De Palma's Carrie, the 1976 Carrie, not the recent remake of Carrie. I say all these 70s movies are being remade now in the 2000s. And we'll look at the emergence of the blockbuster in this period, as well as the horror film. And we'll move on. We have a guest speaker coming, by the way, David Lazar, who has written in a sort of creative nonfiction way about film. I'm not sure what he's going to talk about yet, so I haven't scheduled the screening for that week, but he is definitely going to be an interesting speaker and visitor in our class in early November. Then again, there's another Monday with no classes, no screening. That week, you will be watching the film on your own, Dog Day Afternoon. You know, get it ahead of time. Know that you have to watch Dog Day Afternoon on your own, either through Netflix or in the library, whatever. Dog Day Afternoon is a Sidney Lumet film with Al Pacino in it. Maybe you know this film already. Does a great sort of signature performance. This is about a bank robbery in New York. Again, it's a New York film. It's a kind of hostage-taking situation, and our readings have to do with the whole concept of hostage-takings in the media at this point. And we will move on from that to John Waters, who began to sort of make waves in the art movie community with his Pink Flamingos, and we're going to see his film, where is it, Female Trouble, screening on Monday, November 18th, and we'll read a great essay on Female Trouble by Carl Schoonover that puts it in the context of Julio Garcia Espinosa's For an Imperfect Cinema. This will be our week of bad taste in cinema, but also sort of cult cinema. No doubt you already know John Waters' work, but you may not have seen his earlier films. So Female Trouble, with Divine, that great cross-dressing actor. We will then move on to a second film by Sidney Lumet, Network, which I just had to put on here. If you've been watching that series, The Newsroom, it's based off of Network, totally. It's a total rip-off of Network. If you haven't seen Network already, you'll see it in this course. That'll be great. 1976, and we'll talk about what's going on with media and the news in the 70s through Network. It's a very cynical movie too, though. So we'll talk about cynicism in film. And finally, at the end of the semester, we will have our only Vietnam film, because although some documentaries had been made about Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and yet they weren't very widely seen, Hollywood did not start making feature films about Vietnam until several years after the end of the war. It's as though it was too painful to think about early in the 70s during the war. So we don't really see film versions of it until after 1977, 78. So we'll be looking at we'll come back to Jane Fonda again, who was instrumental in the making of this film. Coming Home, directed by the great director Hal Ashby, also a big 70s director. And we'll look at how the Vietnam War was represented in the media throughout the unfolding of the 70s, particularly during the Nixon administration. And then we'll look at this reparative work that was going on in films like Coming Home. There are other films as well in the same year, in fact. The Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, etc., that were sort of revising and rethinking the whole Vietnam War. And the final exam will be given in final exam week. We'll have one day set aside to prepare for it during our screening time. I'm not going to screen a film in our last 2 hours of class. We'll prepare for our final exam. Okay, I'm going to end this part 2 and maybe just give you a small part 3 for some recaps to be continued.